This is a Galway City Museum podcast. On the 11th of April 1923, shortly before the end of the Irish Civil War, 5 anti-treaty Republicans from County Galway were executed at Tuam Barracks, having been found guilty by a Free State military court of the unlawful possession of arms and ammunition. They were Francis Cunnane, aged 23, Michael Monaghan, aged 22, Martin Moylan, aged 24, John Newell, aged 29, and James O'Malley, aged 25. Here, historian Cormac Ó Comhraí discusses the executed men, the end of the Irish Civil War and its legacy.
I suppose this is the culmination of 3 talks. The first I gave in the museum here in January, around about the same time as the 100th anniversary of the executions in Athlone. 5 guys were executed, four of them from North Galway, and one of them who was involved in North Galway was from Athlone originally. They were executed in Athlone in Tuam Barracks in January 1923. I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago out in Kilcoona, out near Headford, to the local Heritage Society, and now obviously this one we're coming towards the end of the decade of centenaries. And it's been a pleasure and it's been an honour to be involved in bringing sort of this information that I've kind of picked up over almost 20 years at this stage, out of the archives, out of kitchens where I'll be chatting to people about their relatives, old newspapers and the like, to a broader audience than just merely those who might read it in an article or a book or whatever. Okay. But it's important. I was just chatting to a colleague in history just before I started the talk, just about how much information people actually have themselves, even people who think that they know very little. But it's those little anecdotes about the personal relationships between 2 people, a family relation, the fact that people were neighbours, the fact that people from one side of the corridor tended to marry across the other side of the corridor, all these things. It's important to note these if you can, to pass on this information to further generations, but also historians, because the little bit of information that you have, or you feel that you have, that could be the missing ingredient or the missing part of the jigsaw that helps somebody 20 or 30 years down the line to understand fully or approaching fully what happened in a particular incident. The other thing as well is photographs. My appeal in these situations is always to make sure to ask people to name the people in a photograph and the occasion in which it was taken, because what might be very obvious to yourself now mightn't necessarily be the case in 10 or 20 years' time to yourself, because somebody else looking at that photograph. The amount of times I heard people, I saw photographs of clearly immense historical importance, but people would kind of say, I can tell you who the men in the photograph are, but I have no idea who the girls are, and this kind of thing. I even saw, for the first time, I saw a picture of a granduncle of my own a week ago. I'd never seen a photograph of him before. As far as I know, this is the only photograph of him that survives. And he was with some woman with no idea who the woman was. It wasn't his wife. But other than that, so like as I said, that was obviously a huge interest to myself. Now, we're by this stage in the Civil War, in April of 1923. The Civil War itself is becoming increasingly bitter. Now, it's important to remember, obviously, 2 things: that there was not an awful lot of bitterness from the start, from the time of the treaty debates, but even before that, during the War of Independence, rivalry between various units of the IRA, between the IRA and other nationalist groups, and this kind of thing, and then obviously personal grievances and spite and that kind of thing. Now, from the Republican point of view, there are 6 basic reasons why their bitterness increased during the Civil War. One of them was the recruitment of ex-British soldiers to take part in the activities of the National or the Free State Army, whichever you want to call it. In coming up to the start of the Civil War, the British had disbanded the Irish regiments of the British Army. An awful lot of these men were now unemployed, and they're coming home to a country with high unemployment, and an awful lot of them joined the new National Army. And this created obviously an awful lot of bitterness. Non-Republicans and previous enemies of the Republic were seen to be ingratiating themselves in the new Free State that had been founded in 1922. So all of a sudden, all these guys who had contributed very little during the War of Independence, some of them had been very hostile to the republicanism, were now all of a sudden being prominently identified with supporting the Free State. Now I'd be including farming organisations there. They were kind of regarded with scepticism by Republicans, business organisations, ex-soldiers groups, but also, as I said, other nationalist groups like supporters of the Irish Parliamentary Party and this kind of thing. The Guards, for example, turned to some ex-members of the RSE for, when they established a new policing force. They were used to policing. They tried to make sure that that those that they gave employment to had, we'd say, what they would have called good records during the War of Independence, as in that they were seen as being friendly to nationalism and to the Republic. But then there was also allegations that guys who'd been anti-Republican had now got jobs in the Guards and this kind of thing. The executions obviously were a major part of it. Who was selected, how they were selected, and when they were executed and that kind of thing. All these things caused immense bitterness afterwards, and we'll get to this later. Shooting of prisoners, guys who've been arrested, and again, much like what happened during the War of Independence, allegations that shot while trying to escape or shot while evading arrest was merely a cover for being shot out of hand. Fellas being shot with their arm, their hands up, and there was plenty of these kind of allegations. So much so that again, you would say that yes, this was definitely happening in some places. The army weren't being very particular about taking prisoners and maintaining their safety. The excommunication of Republicans by the Catholic Church caused massive bitterness. Oddly enough, despite the fact that in Republican folklore, the bishops were remembered as being particularly hostile, when you kind of dive down into the evidence, it was often local parish priests rather than, we say, necessarily the bishop. They often took it upon themselves to go further than what the bishop had actually originally suggested, and that kind of thing. And Republicans really had to learn, they had to have a mental map. If you wanted to get confession, if you wanted to get communion, you kind of developed a mental map about, well, this parish would be, the Catholic clergy would be hostile, but 2 parishes further along, this is where you go to bring your child to be baptised, or for a funeral or whatever. Okay, and finally, attacks on the Catholics in the north, and this kind of poison stuff throughout the entire island, but obviously throughout the south. There's sectarian violence in the north. The victims are overwhelmingly Catholic. An awful lot of attacks on civilians rather than necessarily Republicans, and some horrific stories are coming out. And it hardens hearts, not just against, we'd say, loyalists in the south, but in a general sense. There's a real sort of sense of bitterness about the way things have turned out. Okay, if you're a Republican, everything's going wrong. Now, on the other side, from the Free State or the pro-treaty point of view, again, they too are also becoming increasingly bitter about the way things are going, about the threats to this new state that was going to give them almost entire freedom as they saw it within the 26 counties, and now those being endangered and threatened by the Republican resistance to the treaty settlement and to the 1922 election and the establishment of the Free State. So revolution threatened the status quo. So, for example, in times of revolution, young people gain power. Right? Poor people gain power, and women gain power over men. Now, all these things threatened the status quo, but there was also an awful lot of anarchy as well. I mean, this is a period when the RIC is being withdrawn, the IRA is disintegrating, and the Guards haven't been fully established either. So there's an awful lot of threats not just to theoretical ideas of who should be in charge and levels of equality and all this kind of thing, but also just to public safety, to people with property, to people with very little property. The guns are pulled out during local grievances. The guns are, people are shot in rows internally within family, not necessarily to kill, but it is a period of mass, regular violence in local disputes. Now, as the IRA, as the area under their control contracts throughout the country, their campaign becomes increasingly destructive and less military. I mean, they start the Civil War with holding positions of military value, if you like, barracks and the like. They burn them, they retreat to the countryside. Then it goes into a guerrilla phase with attacks on soldiers. Now, the Republicans are often reluctant, and even on the other side, there's people who are reluctant to engage each other. They have ideas about, let's reunite and attack the North and this kind of stuff. I don't want to shoot former comrades. Like Tom Maguire, the area we're talking about today, about Tuam, Tom Maguire would have been the commanding officer of the IRA in sort of East Mayo, part of Roscommon and East Galway, most of East Galway. And he said, he had a quote about, at the start, I couldn't get fellas to shoot at the staters. Okay, so people didn't really want to fully engage with the Civil War, and by the time the Republicans figured out that they were involved in a war, they'd already basically lost. But as the campaign went on, it became less military, and a lot of the targets became more symbolic. So there's a period of the destruction of the homes, not just of the large houses, of the landlord class, but also of the support of, we'd say, supporters of the Free State, either people who are involved at a political level, but also as well even at a local level. Relatives of leading figures on the Free State are targeted, either directly or indirectly, and some of these people end up dying. Kevin Higgins' father, an uncle of W.T. Cosgrave, the 7-year-old son of Sean McGarry dies when his house is burned in Dublin, for example. And all these things engender bitterness. Thirdly, the death of Collins. Collins, obviously himself, is one of the major reasons why the treaty is passed. Support, and you have a certain amount of support within previous members of the IRA for the treaty because of Collins. And then Collins is killed in an ambush in Cork, but also at a more local level. You have people who are seen as having good fighting records from 1916 or the War of Independence. Guys who've done an awful lot for the revolution are killed on the pro-treaty side, and again this causes an awful lot of bitterness. Now I know there was like a battalion commandant called Martin Rooney that was shot down near Cosh in Athenry, for example. That attracted an awful lot of controversy. It's difficult to imagine, to work out exactly what happened, but in that case it was there was an altercation when Republicans and a funeral cortege of another soldier came into contact with each other, and just nobody knows exactly what happened, despite its use for propaganda at the time. But then again, you have that period in other places, if you look at even Collins' group of who were involved in intelligence with them in Dublin. Frank Thornton is seriously wounded in Tipperary in an ambush. His brother Hugh Thornton is killed down in Cork. There's, in Laois, a county that had seen very little IRA military activity during the War of Independence. There's a massive ambush at a place called Tunduff, and two leading IRA officers from Tipperary, who had previously been IRA men but were now pro-treaty, are killed in an ambush, and this attracts national attention. Oh, these fellas now are ambushing the Irish Army. Okay, so this is something that's constantly thrown at Republicans. Where were you kind of during the War of Independence, and now you're killing the guys who took part in the War of Independence. And finally, that gap between the alleged gap between a War of Independence performance and Civil War battle performance attracts much negative comment, even by people who hadn't necessarily been supportive of the War of Independence or the IRA campaign during the War of Independence, where they kind of give out about it. And that's something that's thrown at Galway on a regular basis. Galway had been out in 1916. It was seen as in Dublin, unfairly to some degree, as having underperformed militarily during the War of Independence, And now this was kind of thrown at them again during the Civil War, going, okay, now you're willing to fight and this kind of thing. Okay? Now the executions up until this point. The first 12 occur in Dublin. Now, other than Erskine Childers and the executions that followed the shooting of Sean Hales, pro-treaty TD, those are the executions that saw the execution of Liam Mellows, for example, and 3 others. The volunteers who were shot were a very ordinary in terms of they weren't exceptional. They weren't in terms of officer class. They weren't particularly prominent in terms of let's say their 1916 background or their war of independence background. They were often fairly young, and even the things that they were accused of were often at a very kind of low level, being arrested with firearms rather than specific charges against them of, being involved in ambushes or assassinations and the like. Okay. Now, so the first 12 are in Dublin. 19th of December, there's executions to Curra, then in Kilkenny, and to the end of December, Dublin, Dundalk, Roscrea, and on the 20th, there's a massive executions in one day in Tralee, Limerick, and Tuam Barracks in Athlone. And the question that was often asked was why, and there was a sense that it was a deliberate campaign by the government, the government of the Free State, to try and spread the terror, as it was called. And essentially, what that meant was that if you executed guys in Dublin, the impact of it along the western seaboard was much less than if you executed people within their home areas. Okay. The other thing as well was that it's possible, but it might have been a way of making sure that provincial military leaders couldn't avoid culpability, that nobody could come then at the end of the Civil War and say, well, I had no executions in my area, right? I was alright. And again, this is a period where the Free State government constantly worried about the loyalty of their own soldiers. How, when push came to shove, would the men under their command, would they revert to their old comrades, or would they toe the line with a government policy? And that was never fully certain. Even up to the end of the Civil War, like for example, like there was one group, for example, that was targeted for executions at this period in the middle of the Civil War, were soldiers who had previously served in the Free State who deserted to the Republican side, and that was an issue throughout the Civil War. Even at the end of the Civil War, there was a guy down in Tipperary called Ned Summers who was killed in an incident after not exactly the end of the Civil War, but the first end of the Civil War, if you like. I'll explain that again. But he had been in the army and defected in December of 1922 when executions were in full swing, and that was probably the reason why he defected. He changed sides. Now at that stage, the Republicans, they were going to be beaten one way or the other, and he still switched over. Okay. Now the situation in April of 1923, the West was still problematic. Okay, it wasn't maybe as troublesome as Kerry, but you had groups of Republicans all over the province, and within Galway, the most problematic areas for the government and for the army would have been the area around Headford, in that general North Galway area, Headford, Milltown, over as far as Tuam and that kind of thing, and West Connemara. The rest of the county was essentially pacified, except for kind of low-level raids, the odd shooting incident, but that would have involved small groups of Republicans, where you still had columns operating in those two areas there, that general North Galway area and West Connemara. As the Free State, as the army, and as the guards, to some degree, as they began to assert their control over rural areas, these areas where you had Republican activists who were fairly strong, they became more separated from each other. It became harder for them to function. So, for example, in the January executions in 1923, the war at that time in the West is being prosecuted from Athlone. By the time of these executions, it's the Clare Morris command that carries out these executions. Okay, so again, if you like, the Republican territory has just been broken up constantly from each other. Now, obviously, that was much easier for those forces to raid areas around the west than it would have been from Macon in Athlone in a period before proper transport. Okay. Now, the OC, the officer commanding of that Tuam Barracks command, was Michael Hogan. Now, Hogan was native of South Galway. His brother was Paddy Hogan, the Minister for Agriculture in the 1920s, when the Free State was established. He'd been involved in the War of Independence, and he'd served in the Civil War in Kerry, probably the most bitter of the counties in terms of the legacy of the Civil War. Okay. Now, April 1923. So why the executions then, right? And that's the next part of the talk. Now, effectively, there was a stay of execution effectively in late January and February, and the reason was why the moratorium was there was there seemed to be some movement within republicanism towards peace from the Free State, from the government side. Liam Deasy, a senior IRA officer, had been arrested, and he had basically called for an end to the Civil War. And this was replicated in various prisons, where guys in various prisons basically said, en masse, yep, these guys are within the prison are talking for us, and all of us think that it's time for this thing to end. Yeah. Okay, so massive numbers of prisoners were kind of saying, yeah, look, it's time to end this. And the government kind of, held back for a while, just so that they could say, okay, well, what's going on? Is anything going to come out of this? And the leadership of the IRA was actually, I won't say splitting because it would be fake, but it was divided on the issue of continuing and prosecuting the war. Now, at the top, the Chief of Staff, Liam Lynch, was optimistic about the future for success, but his own leadership really wasn't. There was splitting, kind of, you could say, probably three ways. One group that felt this is over, it's time to call it, just say, right, this is coming to an end. A second group who felt, who were unwilling to give that order to end out of a sense of duty to guys who were willing to keep on fighting, but they didn't really think it was winnable, but they didn't want to be seen to be the ones who were saying, right, we have to end this. Okay, and the third group was people like Lynch who thought, no, we can keep this going. And in some areas, the morale of Republican units is fairly good. I mean, basically, during the War of Independence, geographical isolation worked against you in terms of activity. It's harder to get weapons in, training officer, this kind of stuff. In the Civil War, it actually aided you. So we'll say in some areas, like if a ceasefire order hadn't been issued, like the war could have continued indefinitely for years. In places like Mayo, Kerry, for example, but other places. Okay, so in April 1923, there seems to be some. It's not clear. We don't really have full evidence of this, but there seems to be some effort at a last push in the West, probably as a result of Liam Lynch's optimism. Okay, we'll give it one last push on behalf of the Republic, and we'll see what happens. Can we break the resolve of those who support the Free State to keep this thing going? Okay, and the idea was that you'd have kind of amass a series of attacks all over in different divisional areas. Okay, now as it happened, the only major attack that occurred was the attack on Headford Barracks in April of 23 on the 8th, led by Christy Mackin and another fellow that was mentioned in terms of leadership was a fellow called Vincent Corcoran, who was from Kilcoona. Now, Mackin was from Imbrin. He was actually, his father was a Mayo man. He was actually apparently related to Tom Maguire, but it was a distant relation. And his father took a job teaching in Cresharig, in kind of the Imbrin area. And Mackin was in the local IRA, young fella. He was in the local IRA. He goes up to Dublin, become a primary teacher, and Pat's, the St. Pat's, the training college for teachers, was used as an officer corps for the IRA. So Mackin's sent down to Mayo and Galway during the truce to organise camps to try and get the IRA on a more military footing. And he rises up. He's clearly very competent, and he's popular and he's respected. He's good at what he does, training and organising people, and he kind of rises up to the ranks. And by this stage, he would have been Maguire, who would have been arrested. So Mackin would have been indirectly. He ended up as the successor of the Second Western Division. Okay, so he leads. He's one of the leaders of this attack on Headford Barracks. Now, the information is slightly unclear, but as far as we can be certain, there was 3 fatalities, possibly 4, but it's not fully certain, right? But 3 fatalities, anyways, in the attack on Headford Barracks. Sergeant Thomas Keane was from the Clifton area. Private James Lyons was from Kilcoona, near Auckland, that area, and Sergeant Major John Carthy, just on the Roscommon side of that Galway-Roscommon border. On the Republican side, there's two fatalities. At the time, John Higgins, a local man, he's from Gardenfield, he's killed. His body is found the next day, and Dan McCormack dies later. He's from an area called Liskeavy, near Milltown, kind of a very strong staunch Republican background, that area, and he's badly wounded, and he dies in 1928 from wounds received during the attack in Headford Barracks. Now, a number of soldiers are wounded, and these later apply for compensation. One of them is Harry Burke, a guy from Moylach in northeast Galway, and he's discharged from the army as being medically unfit for service in 1924 because of the wounds received at Headford. The following year, he wins an Ireland with Galway. A credit to the capabilities of the medical profession in Galway at the time. Now, so he's the kind of the most significant of those who were wounded. And again, he would have had a Republican background during the War of Independence. Now, why Tuam? Right. So on the 11th of April, 6 men are executed in Tuam workhouse. So, but they were being held in Galway jail. So why? I mean, one logical response would have been that obviously the impact in a small town like Tuam would have been close to the area where the attack occurred would have been much more significant than executing them in Galway. But Galway was a small city at the time. But really, the reason seems to be that the Bishop of Galway, Thomas O'Dea, had just died. Now again, O'Dea sort of highlights the fact how complicated the question of the bishops was, because O'Dea wouldn't have been regarded as being that severe on the Republicans compared to other bishops who were very, very anti-Republican in the Civil War. He would have been very popular during the War of Independence, for example, for the way in which he criticised Crown forces. I mean, bear in mind that this is the diocese where Father Griffin, for example, had been killed, but there are also other Texan clergymen. But Bishop O'Dea, anyways, had just died, and seemingly there was a reluctance on the part of the authorities to have executions during a period of mourning in the city, and that seems to be the reason why they were brought to Tuam. Frank Cunnane was the most senior of them in terms of rank within the IRA from Kilcoona. His nephew's with us. John Maguire from Cross. He was the brother of Tom Maguire, who would have been the IRA commanding officer in the general South Mayo, East Galway area. There was always suspicion that Maguire was selected as an attack on his brother. But we'll come to that again. Seamus O'Malley from Up the Road, actually it should be US. And I know as well, actually, his nephew told me the last time that he was always referred to as John rather than Sean. The name Sean you often see in Republican memorabilia and commemorations and the like. And I do think it's important that we try kind of remember these men as they were called, rather than necessarily as the symbols they became. Seamus, as I said, is US. I checked it this morning. It's the it's the US on his memorial card, so that'll be the one that I would generally use. Michael Monaghan from Cunnane near Headford. Martin Moylan from Farmerstown, Corndulla, that Annadown area, and then Sean Ewell from Wynford, again part of that general Headford area. Now, in terms of their activity, Monaghan and Moylan seems to have been involved in the Killer Ambush. That was a major ambush in January 1921, where the auxiliaries, a force that were put in to try by the British to try and break the revolution during the War of Independence. There was 6 or 7 of them wounded, and there was massive reprisals in the period in Headford after that ambush. I think four fellows were shot in the 4 days that followed the ambush. There was mass burnings, including attacks in your own home. So they were clearly, very active men. They all were. They all had records going back to the War of Independence. These weren't fellows who joined during the truce. And again, there was an allegation being made by both sides against each other. All you fellows joined during the truce. You saw no action during the War of Independence. And because these men died, it's impossible really to say with any degree of certainty how much and what they were involved in. But just to give you an example, Frank Cunnane was a significant local officer. The son of the principal of Kilcoona, a national school. He was, he would have been a very well-respected figure locally. And the type of people that the British commented on, for example, that came to the fore during the Revolution. They were reasonably well educated by local standards, well respected within the communities, and this was, the more intelligent of the British officer class understood this, rather than just saying, "Oh, they're all thugs and gurriers and that kind of thing." And an awful lot of the propaganda that was used by the British in the War of Independence, it was replicated during the Civil War again, then in terms of propaganda by newspapers and by the government. So why were they selected? Okay, they were selected for geographic reasons, right? Maximising again the impact of, well, you fellas attacked our barracks, now we're going to execute guys from this area. There were in terms of their profiles, other than within obviously their own areas, there were people of who didn't have a high profile. As I said, there was a massive question about John Maguire. Was he just shot as a way of getting after his brother, who was a TD, who had come close to execution himself apparently in January of 1923, but wasn't executed. Now, Tuam Maguire later on felt that probably being a TD might well have been what saved him. The fact that the government didn't want to be seen to be officially executing TDs on the other side. But that there was family folklore. They were told by somebody who'd been working in the prison at the time of those January executions that it was just a mistake. They went to the wrong cell and took the wrong fella. Now, we can't, obviously there's no way of corroborating that one way or the other. I would say that probably being a TD, probably they would have been reluctant, at least officially, to shoot TDs. The O'Malley connection. O'Malley was arrested on the East Galway side of Lough Corrib, but he was from Uchterard. The involvement of Christy Mackin as leading the attack as a Connemara man, might that have gone against him? Might the fact that he was a Connemara man on the far side of Lough Corrib possibly gone against him? Because I'm explaining why the reason. I just want to go to the next slide. So these men who were executed were captured in a place called Cloods in February of 1923. O'Malley was captured close to that area in another town, and again, this would have been an area with safe houses. There would have been no safe houses at the time. So they're captured and arrested in February of 23. Now, he was an awful bad luck, O'Malley. There had been a jailbreak. 14 prisoners got out of Galway jail in March of 1923, down where the Catholic Cathedral is now. They had help from the inside. A soldier had helped them and smuggled in a rope ladder into the prison. And as well as the guys who got over the wall, there was a bunch of prisoners out of their cells waiting to get over the wall, and O'Malley was one of them. So if the order had been slightly different, getting over the ladder, possibly what went against him to some degree. There was a couple of other things. The 4th Western Division, which is West Galway and West Mayo and North Mayo, they were much stronger than the 2nd Western. They were more militant. They threatened reprisals against Free State reporters in the event of any of their men being executed. They put together a list and said, right, if any of our lads are executed, we're going to start shooting fellas that are on this list. That might have been one of the reasons that no men from that divisional area, for example, were executed who were involved in that area. So even geographically, while he was from there, the fact that he was resting on the other side of Lough Corrib kind of meant that they didn't really fully regard him as being part, as the army as having executed one of their own men. Another thing possibly that went against him was the fact that he was he'd been during the War of Independence. O'Malley had been involved with the IRA in Liverpool, and they were arrested and he served time in prison in England, and they were released in February of 1922 after the treaty was accepted, and they were released and they came home. Now, apparently, according to one of the men who was with them, O'Malley had been, like the rest of them, it had been intended that he would join the army, the new army, the Free State Army. This was before the Civil War, and he went down home, got chatting to some of the fellas in his own area, and said, "No, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to be anti-treaty." Again, you don't know. This is all speculation. It's possibly something that went against him. I could have just sometimes these things are as simple as just bad luck. So final letters. Now we don't have the same record of these men who were executed in April of 23 as we do of January of 23. Okay, but if we just look at the kind of the thoughts they expressed in their last letters. This is a common theme. I hope we are the last to die for Ireland across the country. Okay, and as I said, signed Mickey Monaghan and Michael. The morale of the men. Monaghan, Moyle, and Seamus O'Malley. Seamus again, the as that's the modern spelling. Sang songs. Frank Cunnane told his mother that believing that I did the best for my country. Okay, believing that I did the best for my country. So again, just it kind of speaks to how they felt about it. There was a story told in Republican propaganda at the time that when Seamus O'Malley was told that he was to be executed, that there was a picture of Pearse in the office that they were told they were formed, and he went over and he picked up the picture of Pearse and he gave it a kiss. Right? Whether that was just propaganda, I don't know. One of the common characteristics in these types of letters was actually those who wrote these letters were thinking of others. So Monaghan, for example, said that it was worse for you and the poor people at home. Frank Cunnane wrote to his sister Tess, I ask you to cheer up and be brave. Seamus O'Malley wrote, Mother, you reared me, and when I came of age it was for the freedom of my country I worked and not for you. And there's a kind of a hint of regret in O'Malley's, not so much in terms of like everything he did for Ireland, but just in terms of the impact it would have on his mother. I think that's in O'Malley's letter. Now, during this period, you have attacks being carried out by Republicans on soldiers on the Free State side, in reprisal for guys being executed. And the IRA itself wasn't unified about this response. Some officers were strongly in favour of it, some of them were opposed to it. I thought it was kind of unsoldierly and that kind of thing. Okay, so Frank Cunnane wrote in his last letter, let no act of vengeance mar the cause for which I die. Okay, so appealing that there would be no reprisals carried out for his death. And as I said, at the time there was burnings of houses, but also occasionally shootings in revenge for executions being carried out. Now I think this as well, it's important to look at the ideology and the thoughts these men had. Sometimes it can be easy to kind of dismiss them as kind of just straightforward nationalists or guys who just kind of followed the local leaders and didn't think all that much for themselves and that kind of thing. But for example, Cunnane spoke about the voice of Pearson Plunkett inspired me to follow in the footsteps. Some of them tried in their letters to give some sort of explanation for their own political development. So Cunnane is identified with 1916 in that sense of sacrifice, but also the ideology of the rising. He wrote, "We're not waging a war of Bolshevism." Now, that's kind of a tricky one. It's a bit ambiguous in terms of what exactly he means by that. The Russian Revolution that occurred in 1917, there was a civil war while this is going on in Russia, and obviously the communists were known as Bolsheviks at the time, but Bolshevism was kind of used as well at the time as a kind of a word for anarchy. It wasn't necessarily ideologically communism or socialism that he was referring to necessarily here. A lot in the IRA, they mightn't have been they mightn't have read left-wing books or anything, but for example, a lot of them would have strong notions that land, for example, should be subdivided, taken from the rich and divided in a way that maximised the amount of people who could live comfortably on the land. So there would have been in some degree, in some things economically, would have been on the left. Okay, and that would have been the common idea in an awful lot of them. And even during this period in North Galway, during the revolutionary period, and in Galway in general, the line between local land agitation and Republican activism would often have been sort of fairly thin in various things. So it's hard to understand exactly what he meant there. O'Mall is signed in Irish, okay? Again, which is kind of exceptional. He referred to 1916, and it's probably the first man in the Roar to be jailed. Like O'Mall was very underpendent. Now, it was noted at the time that these bodies, when they were executed, the bodies were kept from their families. They weren't returned until the following year, 1924. On the other side, Liam Lynch, the chief of staff, when he was shot, the body was handed over immediately because he wasn't executed. He was killed in action. So his body was handed over, and the town commission in Tuam at a meeting passed a resolution appealing in 1923 for the bodies to be handed over. I think that the wording of the resolution is very interesting for a couple of things. That we respectfully request His Grace the Archbishop of Tuam and through the other bishops of Ireland to use their influence with the Free State government to have a stop put to such executions in future, as already more than enough blood has been spilt and young lives sacrificed in this unholy war. Now, there's two things there. Thomas Gilmartin, the Archbishop of Tuam, would have been seen as being very hostile to the Republicans. That was one thing. Secondly, the idea was that the bishops, that the government was, would have been very much willing to listen to the bishops. The government would have listened to them, but in the Civil War, they did their own thing, rather than following what the bishops were telling them to do. The second thing is this was coming now. Further, that we join with other public bodies in the suggestion that Monsignor Lucio, papal envoy, be invited to act as an intermediary between the two contending parties to negotiate an honourable peace. Now, there's two things there. Sorry, you can't see them. This was a representative of the Vatican who came to Ireland to find out what the hell was going on. Okay, and it kind of the pro-treaty side didn't really particularly didn't want this interfering by the church. The bishops weren't thrilled with the idea, but also as well he was seen as giving too much status to the Republican side, and this rankled with the government in Dublin. And the other thing as well is to note here is that the town commissioners, they wanted to negotiate an honourable peace. Well, effectively that was saying that both sides were on a level. And this was something throughout the Civil War that the Free State government was saying, we're not on a level, we're not negotiating with these guys. This is a surrender or nothing. Okay? And then, as I said, just to finish up at the end of it, we tender the bereaved parents and relatives of the deceased young men our heartfelt sympathy, and we are of the opinion that as Liam Lynch was accorded a public funeral this week, that the bodies of these young men should be given over to their relatives for interment. Now, eventually in October of 1924, the bodies were handed over out of Tuam Barracks in Athlone, where most of them were buried in Donapatrick, but Seamus O'Moy was returned to Uachtarord. There's a big Republican plot even today in Donapatrick. It's a major section in one corner of the graveyard, and a scene for many years of sort of I suppose pilgrimage in one sense to pay the respects for the men who were executed. Now, in the aftermath, when Fianna Fáil came to power in the 1930s, in the 20s, later Fine Gael introduced a system of pensions and compensations to try and take the sting out of the end of the Civil War, because they needed to reduce the army very, very quickly. The army was far too large for peace times. So one of the ways they kind of made sure that they carried out the demobilisation relatively quietly was to compensate and to have pensions for guys who'd been involved in the Civil War. When Fianna Fáil came to power then in the 30s, that was also a way that they brought guys out of republicanism over to support the Fianna Fáil government and the state, got them out of the IRA and out of Cunnane and supporting the institutions of the state. And the pensions, you can imagine the Wall Street crashes happened, the depression, guys who hadn't had regular employment for years, suffered burnings and the like, and it did bring over an awful lot of active Republicans of the 1920s to the new state in the 30s. The Cunnane and the Maguire families never applied for compensation in the 1930s. I think it was £112 you're entitled to if your son had been executed, but it was son. Okay, and in the case of the Maguire family, it was politics. They remained staunchly Republican and kind of basically refusing to recognise the legitimacy of the new state and the government of 26 counties and the like. Another reason as well that people accepted or weren't given compensation was if the parents were dead. Okay, occasionally you could get compensation if it could be proven that you're a dependent, but there were some horrible cases. If you look at the files for compensation of people who were rejected for reasons. Dick Tuig was a guy who was executed in Dublin at the start of the Civil War, one of the first four, and he starts his last letter, "Dear Mother," and she applied for compensation later, but she was denied it on the basis that she was his stepmother rather than his mother, and she raised him since he was 3 years old. So that kind of thing, they could be very, very harsh and very unforgiving in terms of people who fell just outside the boundaries of what the way things were worded. Now, on the other side, an awful lot of people who were on the pro-treaty side also felt bitterness about the way the new state worked out. Bear in mind that from 1932, when Fianna Fáil comes into power, they just keep winning elections, right? So, for example, a brother of the Sergeant Major, Carthy, who was killed in Headford, he wrote complaining that since the start of the Cunnane which is Fine Gael later, right? Myself and my father were tally agents for the party in Haskell and Kilcoona schools, and see how we were treated after all. Going, look, we should be treated better than this, small compensations for guys who've been killed and having to, humiliating, having to prove yourself that you were poor and this and needing of the money and this kind of thing. He also wrote, "I done all the meetings in Galway with him," Paddy Hogan, a brother of Michael Hogan, right? "I done all the meetings in Galway with him, myself and Sean Broderick, there was an Athenry, presumably that's a TD there. And at that time, they wouldn't be let speak on a platform by the hooligans of the country. When Fianna Fáil came to power in 1932, they let lads who were in the IRA out of jail, and there was trouble at coming away at meetings then, you see, where there was a headline in the public at the time, no free speech for traitors. Now, to some degree, that happened, that was a part of elections at the time anyway. Like even during the time of the Civil War in 22 or 23, people are commenting on how quiet the election is compared to what they were like before that. So like, it would have been assumed that you, if you're given a speech, that you were going to be heckled, that there could be fisticuffs, there could be stones thrown, that kind of thing. Now, Thomas Kane, the sergeant who was shot, father from Clifton, the civic guards, the guards would have been used to investigate how poor these people were and that they actually needed money. The civic guard reports that the applicant owns a small farm, that's the father, applicant owns a small farm of 9 acres at Ballinaboy, Clifton. This land, of which 3 acres is underwater, is very poor. So you had this process of basically having to prove that you needed it, as I said. Now, aside from that, another cause of the bitterness in terms of these executions at the end of the Civil War was that it was felt that the Civil War was coming to an end. That it was clear to all sides that this thing was coming to an end, and there was a sense that they were kind of needlessly vengeful. Now, from the pro-treaty point of view, from the government, the army's point of view, they were saying, well, there was no guarantee that things were going to come to an end. This thing could have gone on for years, and that they were using these executions to try and ensure that that the Civil War will come to an abrupt conclusion, regardless of what happened to Lynch. And then, of course, the fact that they came at the same time as Liam Lynch being dead also added to that sense of that they were sort of vengeful more than actually trying to prevent an extension of the Civil War. The fact that Lynch was dead now, it was probably obvious that things were going to come to an end. But at the same time, when they carried out that executions, they couldn't mean certain that Lynch was dead anyway. I mean, communication wasn't that that good at the time, and Lynch was just dead one day when this happened. Okay, and that's it. I'll open for questions. Okay.